May I introduce now Timothy Clifford, former director of the National Galleries of Scotland. Timothy Clifford was director of the National Galleries of Scotland for more than 20 years, I believe, and it was a particularly brilliant period in the history of that institution. In addition to a great interest in painting and drawing, naturally, his interests are very wide-ranging, and he has a particular interest in the decorative arts. So we've brought all those interests together in the paper that he's going to give now, Raphael and the Decorative Arts.
There is dispute about what constitute the earliest known drawings by Raphael. We must consider two double-sided sheets as preparatory for, or at least very closely connected with the predella of the Birth of the Virgin, completed in 1497 for Santa Maria Nuova in Fano. It formed a part of Perugino's Madonna and Saints altarpiece painted for this church of the Observanti order. Arguably, this predella is a very early work by Raphael, and so too is the drawing in pen and brown ink of a handmaiden holding a basin walking from the right at the Uffizi, Florence, and a sheet formerly attributed to Pinturicchio. Another is the sheet also, but in the Ashmolean, showing on the recto a lute-playing youth, and on the verso a very carefully hatched study in pen and brown ink of a two-handled ascos. It's been suggested that the ascos was intended as an alternative solution to the basin held by the handmaiden in the predella. In the catalogue of the Perugino exhibition, Perugino il Divin Pittore, held in Perugia in 2004, the predella was given back to Perugino along with the two connected sheets. Whichever way we try to define the slender line stylistically between Perugino and the precocious Raphael, it is clear that in this milieu, Raphael would have been very familiar with the classical metalwork vessels at first hand, probably through the collections made by the Montefeltro dukes and dug up in local towns. The drawing has every appearance of having been carefully drawn from a real bronze vessel, and moreover, is sufficiently detailed for a goldsmith to copy. This is significant, for not only does the antique become increasingly important in Raphael's later development, but so too do metalwork vessels. Indeed, if this drawing is agreed to be by Raphael, it demonstrates an extraordinarily precocious interest in antiquities, predating by many years his appointment by Pope Leo X as Commissario dell'Antichità in 1517. Raphael was only 16 when in 1500 he painted the double-sided processional banner, Gonfalone, for the lay confraternity of the Holy Trinity at Città di Castello. It shows on one side the creation of Eve with two guardian angels, and on the other the Holy Trinity with St. Sebastian and St. Roche. The side of the Città di Castello banner, which shows St. Sebastian and Roche, represented as appealing to the Holy Trinity for relief from the plague that had struck the town in 1499, has points in common with an embroidered applique for an orphery in the Metropolitan Museum, New York. This may be because the iconography of the Trinity in Central Italian art of the 15th century is not subject to great variety, but it may be of more significance as many of Raphael's contemporaries certainly designed such embroideries. On such processions, crucifixes, either sculpted or painted, form an essential part of the faithful's liturgical component. A drawing by Raphael at Berlin shows separate images of the Mater Dolorosa and St. Peter, shaded into circles that may have been made in preparation for the lateral terminals of a painted cross. I believe like that at the Museo Poldi Pezzoli in Milan, which I think is by Raphael. But equally, I would suggest, could have served just as well as embroidery patterns. It is possible that such drawings might even have served both purposes, for we know that his older contemporary, Raffaellino del Garbo, reused figures and poses that appeared on embroideries in his paintings, whilst on other occasions he reused such patterns of saints to provide images for stained glass windows, such as those at Massa Martana. Raffaellino made many drawings for ecclesiastical vestments, as can be seen, for example, in a circular study of the Angel of the Annunciation in the Metropolitan Museum, and in the corresponding embroidery that I discovered repeated on a chasuble in the treasury of the cathedral at Esztergom Cathedral in Hungary. When discussing the workshop practices of both Perugino and Pinturicchio, it has long been noted that the decoration of Maiolica made at Daruta, a few miles south of Perugia and Umbria, often repeats these artists' designs quite closely. I point out here, for example, the dish on the left-hand side, which is in the Getty Museum at Malibu, with a detail of Pinturicchio's fresco in the Church of Santa Maria in Araceli, Rome, of the death of San Bernardino. As neither artist's pictures were then engraved, and many of their frescoes and altarpieces were far afield from Umbria, it seems most likely that Perugino and Pinturicchio or their studio assistants provided drawings for these potters' guidance. We can be certain this was the case later in the century when Battista Franco, Taddeo and Federico Zuccaro, and Federico Barocci all supplied original designs to the Dukes of Urbino for Castelduranti, now Urbania, Maiolica. Indeed, this remunerative practice of supplying potters with designs may well have begun even before Perugino and Pinturicchio. Giovanni Santi painted an altarpiece for the Cappella Oliva in the convent of San Francesco, Monte Fiorentino, which was built to contain the marble tombs of Conti Gianfrancesco Oliva and Marsibilia Trinci in about 1484 to 1485, with heraldic Maiolica floor tiles, almost certainly to Santi's designs. The Santi tiles are quite simple and austere, but Perugino and Pinturicchio may well have supplied much more elaborate Gotteschi designs for the intricate Maiolica floor tiles, then so popular. The hexagonal tiles, for example, on the Palazzo Pandolfo e Petrucci in Siena, were almost certainly designed by Pinturicchio, 1509 to 13, who was also responsible for painting frescoes there alongside Signorelli and Girolamo Genga. A Sienese Maiolica dish at the British Museum, which I show on the left, with the arms of Pandolfo e Petrucci, almost certainly depends on such Pinturicchio designs. And we also know Pinturicchio later supplied designs for silver to Perugian goldsmiths. It would be quite wrong to discuss the young Raphael and the Arti Minori without a brief mention of Raphael's frames. Raphael moved to Florence in 1504 and was soon commissioned by Ranieri di Bernardo Dei, a goldsmith and silk merchant, to paint an altarpiece, the so-called Madonna del Baldacchino, now in Palazzo Pitti, Florence, for the Dei Chapel dedicated to San Bernardino in Santo Spirito, Florence. A handsome frame was designed and carved for it, but as Raphael left the altarpiece unfinished when he left for Rome in 1508, another altarpiece by Rosso Fiorentino was substituted within Raphael's frame. A stained glass window, a single lancet of San Bernardino lit the chapel before Raphael was allotted the altarpiece commission. The surviving stained glass resembles Perugino's great stained glass ocular in the same church. We also know from Dei's will of the 20th of July 1506 that there were instructions for appropriately rich vestments to be made for service in the Dei chapel. The existing frame follows a sophisticated design with a pair of stop-fluted Corinthian pilasters, supporting a rich candelabra motif frieze flanked by bodies that break forward carved with the Dei shield of arms that support in turn a heavy triangular pediment, with a coarse foliage corbel supporting a light fitting, and these all appear to be 17th century modifications. The Corinthian pilasters, the upper shafts richly carved with candelabra motifs, are carried on voluted corbels, and onto these have been superimposed in the 17th century shelves for liturgical use. Raphael painted Corinthian pilasters to contain the Sacra Conversazione, and this profile moulded frieze is then repeated in the timber frame, an idea taken from the Pietra Serena Corinthian gigantic columns of the side chapels by Brunelleschi. And this complex carved frieze consists of a series of eagles sheltered by canopies, held by a dorsed semiputi, which are threatened by leaping beasts lunging forward towards cornucopia. We must remember also of the ancient Pastiglia frame on the Conistabile Madonna now in St. Petersburg, which seems to have been modified subsequently, but might have been designed partly by Raphael. But what must have been a very splendid frame was that of the Borghese or Baglioni entombment of 1507, which probably divided into three sections with the entombment below and God the Father with angels above. The entombment was almost certainly flanked by pilasters that supported the panel of God the Father, above within a smaller edicule supported by large volutes, like Pinturicchio's Fossi altarpiece from Santa Maria degli Angeli, which is now in the Galleria Nazionale dell'Umbria in Perugia. It incorporated a painted frieze consisting of 4 panels painted with a dorsed putti, seated flanking a frontal male mask with foliate bifurcate moustache and an antefix, or palmetto, perched on a baluster to form a headdress. But while in Perugia, Raphael struck up a friendship with the goldsmith Cesarino di Francesco Rossetti, or Schetti, who has become the most notable Umbrian goldsmith of his day, with workshops in both Siena and Rome. We know that in 1508, Raphael moved to Rome. The city had now become the richest centre for artistic patronage in Italy under the papacy of Julius II della Rovere. Raphael had close friends at the papal court, notably Baldassare Castiglione of Urbino, Donati Bramante of Urbino, and this important goldsmith Cesarino di Rossetti. On a Raphael drawing in 1508, there are memorandum notes by Raphael about Cesarino returning a sermon, and another for Atlante Baglioni to pay for the entombment. The first payment to Raphael in Rome for the Stanze della Senatura on the 13th of January 1509 is notably addressed to the artist Nel Palazzo Papale da Cesarino, while later in about 1575, the Perugian historian Filippo Alberti recorded in his Elogi degli Uomini Illustri di Perugia that Astore Baglioni II had owned a book of drawings di mano di Cesarino ed in parti de Raffaello. This led Sherman reasonably to suggest this was indeed the young Raphael in Perugia, whom Sherman noted painted jewellery with exceptional understanding and might well have been made pattern drawings for Cesarino's guidance. The most celebrated piece of silver that survived, made by Cesarino, is the bronze and silver gilt reliquary of the Sant'Agnello, we're showing it now, the Holy Wedding Ring, dated 1511, which was and is the most venerated relic in the Cathedral Church of San Lorenzo in Perugia. This wedding ring that the Perugians looted from Chiusi in 1473 is displayed only once a year on the 30th of July. It was always kept behind a grille, behind a curtain, above the great Perugino altarpiece of the betrothal of the Virgin Mary. The Perugino is now in the Musée des Beaux-Arts at Caen, having been looted by the French in 1797. We know Raphael had many contacts with the goldsmith world. In his father's will, Giovanni Santi, on the 29th of July, 1494, we learn that Giovanni appointed as his sole executor one Piero di Parte, described in other documents as Magister or Aurifaber, that is, Master Goldsmith. And only 2 days earlier, he'd appointed as Raphael's tutor and guardian one Lodovico Baldi, a lawyer whose father was Maestro Baldi, Orefice, Master Baldo Jeweller. While in a contract of the 10th of December 1500 for an altarpiece for Città di Castello painted by Giovanni Santi's pupils, we learn that the guarantor of the project was Magister Battista Floridi Aurifex. So, the youthful Raphael in Urbino would have known many of his father's closest friends, some of whom were goldsmiths. And between 1506 and 1508, Raphael was painting another altarpiece, the so-called Madonna del Baldacchino, already mentioned, for goldsmiths, the Dei family in Santo Spirito. We now would expect to find Raphael preparing finished drawings for the embroideries or cartoons for stained glass, as was the practice of other Marchigians like Viti and the two Genga. We lack any contemporary references to Raphael designing intarsia work, but we can be sure he designed silver. In 1506, Raphael provided metalwork drawings for the Della Rovere court at Urbino, designing 2 embossed dishes with gilded handles. Later, the Della Rovere were defeated in battle and exiled from Urbino by Pope Leo X. Eleonora Gonzaga and Elisabetta Gonzaga, respectively Duchess and Dowager Duchess of Urbino, then managed to take some of their plate with them to Mantua. They offered to present them to Isabella d'Este, Marchioness of Mantua. And Isabella d'Este, in letters dated the 15th of June and the 18th of September 1516 from her villa of La Rocchetta, makes it clear that she did eventually acquire 2 coppe of silver gilt and 2 carafes of bronze, which are described as de disegno e foggia antiqua designati per Raphael. That is, designed in the antique manner with foliage by Raphael. We also hear sono fatti a Roma, they were made in Rome. And the counterpart letters from the Della Rovere secretary Benedetto Capilupi to Isabella d'Este survive for the 7th of July and 27th November 1516, stating that they were subsequently acquired by Isabella d'Este and shared by her with Girolamo da Sargo, Bishop of Nizza. Now, when Raphael, at the age of 25, arrived in Rome, Julius II had been Pope for 5 years. And Michelangelo had started work 3 years before on the Pope's tomb, but was now frescoing the Sistine ceiling. The ancient Basilica of St. Peter's was being demolished and replaced with a grand centrally planned structure by Raphael's fellow countryman from Urbino, Donato Bramante. Bramante was also working in the Vatican Palace, and Rome was now fast transforming itself into a worthy successor to its imperial past as Caput Mundi, the most splendid capital in Christendom, with Julius II identifying himself as the successor of St. Peter and the Julian emperors. In 1508, Julius II had reformed the old goldsmiths' guild in Rome, transforming it into the high-sounding Università degli Orefici, and providing them with a site for a church. And one of the 4 consoli of the university, who was given the job of superintending the commissioning and building of this new church, was the celebrated Antonio di Fabri da San Marino, who we know from subsequent documents was a good friend of Raphael. Cellini was to describe him as the first great goldsmith of Rome. And Antonio almost certainly knew Raphael in his youth. We learn that he arrived in Rome in 1476, purchased an active workshop in 1492, and then worked for the court of Urbino in the later 1490s, returning to Rome in 1508. His close friendship with the Sienese banker Agostino Chigi was witness to his marriage in 1512. It's therefore hardly surprising to learn that the commission to build the goldsmith church in Rome, Sant'Eligio degli Orefici, was given sometime before December 1514 to Raphael. Antonio also served as ambassador to San Marino, and it was no coincidence it was the same goldsmith, Antonio de Fabri de San Marino, who was jointly entrusted in the will of the Sienese banker Agostino Chigi to complete his mortuary chapel in Santa Maria del Popolo. And one of San Marino's sons was named after Raphael. And when Raphael died in 1520, he left half of his property in Via Giulia to the goldsmith. It's also tempting to speculate that those familiar metal vessels which are shown by Raphael on the altar to the left of the coronation of the Charlemagne in the Stanze dell'Incendio were copied from real items designed by Raphael himself. But in documents of the 10th of November 1510 and 7th of November 1511, we learnt that Raphael's friend, the goldsmith Cesarino Rochetti, who had incidentally been Antonio de San Marino's pupil, was commissioned by Agostino Chigi to supply 2 tondi in bronze, each 4 palmi in diameter to Raphael's designs. In the published version of the contract now lost, and in another cited by Sherman, the sculpted roundels are described as pluribus floribus, which he argued may have been an incorrect transcription for pluribus figuris. But floribus was clearly repeated in both documents, and we know that they were grandi 4 palmi, and after designs by Maestro Raffaello di Giovanni Santi da Urbino di Pectore. If they were figurative and not floral roundels, they might indeed have been the pair of bronzes of the descent into limbo and the Doubting Thomas, both now in the Abbey of Chiaravalle in Milan. Drawings by Raphael of the descent exist at Lille, which is on the right-hand side, and another in Uffizi. Whilst Raphael studies for the Doubting Thomas in the Stadler Institute, Frankfurt, and the Fitzwilliam Museum, Cambridge. We do know that Cesarino hadn't completed the Tondi within the 6-month time limit stipulated, so these bronzes may well not be by his hand. Pope Hennessy, followed by others, including Oberhuber, argued that the bronzes are by Lorenzo Lotti, called Il Lorenzetto, a second-rate Florentine sculptor who carved the marble Jonah and Elijah after Raphael's designs for the Chigi Chapel in Santa Maria del Popolo. And as the measurements and dates correspond to the Chiaravalle roundels, it would seem contrary to argue that yet another pair of roundels are also being designed simultaneously with flowers. We must, however, remember that this does coincide with a period of intense activity for Raphael, who was making many drawings for Agostino Chigi, and it seems highly likely that Raphael was designing pairs of metal roundels conforming to both descriptions. The goldsmith Antonio San Marino evidently remained in close contact with Raphael and appears in a tax return associated with him in the acquisition of Palazzo Caprini on the 7th of October 1517. Then, on the 15th of May 1518, Antonio paid 300 ducats for una vigna in Rome on behalf of Raphael, which Raphael left in his will to Antonio. And this turned out to be a building site of considerable value on the Via Giulia. Subsequently, we learn from the correspondence of Baldassare Castiglione of 1523 that after the deaths of Raphael and Antonio, that Antonio's widow, Faustina, owned a portrait of Raphael, perhaps a self-portrait, which Castiglione was very keen to acquire. We now know from an article by Irene Brooke in the Burlington magazine last July that Pietro Bembo, sometimes secretary of Leo X, also had associations with Raphael's friend, the goldsmith Antonio de San Marino. From a letter of the 22nd of September 1519 to Bembo from Flavio Crisolino, we gather that Crisolino had asked Raphael to design a frame for an enameled pax and sent Bembo Raphael's good wishes. He wrote that Antonio had found someone to clean the hair and flesh of the figures on the pax at a cost of 2 ducats, that he'd conferred with Raphael, who feels this or even more, was a fair price if the job is well done, and which it undoubtedly will be since the craftsman was a good master. Another letter of the 1st of July 1520 demonstrates that Crisolino was exasperated by both Antonio and by Raphael, writing that in spite of repeated visits to Antonio's shop in Via dei Banchi, the goldsmith didn't appear to have begun the work and had grown deaf to his entreaties. And Crisolino says he'd seen Antonio, who complained that he'd already made 2 pairs of altar cruets which Bembo had rejected, and he wondered why he should waste his time and energy. And Crisolino also said that Raphael does what he likes and not what he's told. It's clear from these documents somewhere there must have existed a body of drawings by Raphael for goldsmith's work, and perhaps more survive than we recognize. There's a study for a salver in the Royal Collection at Windsor, which is on the back of a study for the engraving by Marc Antonio Raimondi of the Massacre of the Innocents, which is generally dated 1509 to 1510. The salver drawing consists of 3 concentric circles drawn with a pair of compasses and outer frieze filled with a battle of marine creatures. The motif of a hippocamp pulling at the hair of a nereid with a head thrown back is closely paralleled by a similar motif recurring in both the drawing and the engraving of the Massacre of the Innocents. The drawing for the dish is in ink over traces of black chalk, and a second, much more highly wrought study, also using compasses in pen and brown ink, brown wash heightened with white over traces of red chalk, for what was probably the same salver or a pair to it is in the Ashmolean Museum, Oxford. The frenzied Palaiuolo-like battle has now calmed down, and the sea creatures are pleasantly relaxed and languid. A third, rather dry workshop cartoon for an entire salver of this type is at Dresden. And we can be fairly sure that these designs were made for Agostino Chigi, that Maecenas who bankrolled Pope Julius II. We know that Chigi hosted the most extravagant banquets at his villa, now called the Villa Varnesina, built by Peruzzi on the banks of the Tiber in Trastevere. He was a major patron of Raphael, both in his chapel of Santa Maria della Pace and Santa Maria del Popolo. And Agostino's annual income was said to be 70,000 ducats, and when he died, his safe contained 90,000 ducats worth of valuables. Allegedly, he spent 500 ducats at one of his dinners, and at another served a sturgeon costing 250 ducats. On one occasion, he was said to have had the silver dishes upon which each course of dinner had been served thrown by his servants into Tiber as a gesture of indifference to such trifles. But it was also said he'd shrewdly taken the precaution of having the net placed beneath the surface of the water so that at night they could be dragged out again. Chigi also had given a dinner at which the food was served on plates engraved with the armorial bearings of his guests, and at which the walls of the banqueting hall were covered with the finest tapestries. At the end of the meal, the Pope, as honoured guest, congratulated his host on the excellence of the food and the magnificence of the setting. Chigi then gave a signal for the cords supporting the arras to be released. The tapestries fell to the floors, revealing empty stalls and mangers. "Your Holiness," he said, "this is not my banqueting hall, it is merely my stable." Chigi also commissioned the Triumph of Galatea fresco from Raphael for the Villa Farnesina, which would have proved a most suitable backcloth for these silver salvers, similarly inhabited with a multitude of marine creatures. We must break off from discussing Raphael's work for Agostino Chigi to recall that the artist in 1513-16 was commissioned by the Blessed Elena Duglioli dall'Olio, an eccentric virgin, to paint the altarpiece of Santa Cecilia for the chapel of Santa Cecilia in the church of San Giovanni in Monte Oliveto, Bologna, which is, of course, here in this exhibition. The original frame, slim and elegant, of cassetta form, finely carved with a rinceau phrase and sumptuously gilded, was almost certainly designed by Raphael, while the carving was probably not made by the local, or might have been made, I gather now, Andrea da Formigine, to whom it has been attributed, but may be carved in Rome. One can easily imagine, on a smaller scale, that it could indeed have been fashioned by a goldsmith. The chapel, incidentally, also boasted a fine silver reliquary containing a knuckle bone of Santa Cecilia, commissioned by Eleanor's admirer and protector, Canon Antonio Pucci, who later became Bishop of Pistoia. It is not recorded if the reliquary was to Raphael's design. On a table in the foreground of Raphael's portrait of Leo X, with his nephews, Giuliano de' Medici and Luigi de' Rossi, now Uffizi, that was painted in 1518, is a prominent gold bell of great refinement, ornamented with a rich rinceau frieze, incorporating a demi-puto issuing from a sort of foliage skirt. The type of figure goes back to antique prototypes, particularly carved marble friezes of the Augustan era. But the design of the bell is strongly Raphaelesque, reminding one of similar elements in the stucco decorations of the Villa Madama. And I would suggest that the bell was probably designed by Raphael and perhaps made by either Cesarino Rossetti or Antonio da San Marino. Raphael was an intimate friend of the great rock crystal engraver Valerio Belli of he painted an exquisite portrait of Belli in oil, 12 centimeters in diameter, that used to belong to Kenneth Clark and is now in a private collection in New York. It is inscribed on the back, Raphael Urbinates, Pinxit, Rome, 1517. The tiny size and unusual profile format for Cinquecento portraits followed a type by then mostly confined to classical coins and portrait medals. And it's been suggested it was made as a gift from Raphael to the gem engraver to thank him for having acted as godfather to Raphael's illegitimate daughter-in-law. The painting, which has a direct provenance in Vicenza through the Belli and Gualdo families, served as the prototype for a marble relief in the Victorian Albert Museum by an unknown master, and also very similar to the anonymous medallic image, which is also probably a self-portrait. and Belli's rock crystals and the bronze plaquettes that derive from them are frequently Raphaelesque in inspiration, or indeed directly taken from Raphael's painted or engraved compositions. But none of them seem to have been designed by Raphael himself. We do, however, know of a finely worked drawing in brown ink heightened with white on blue paper by Raphael's pupil, Polidori da Caravaggio, for the portrayal of Christ Windsor, which was made as a preparatory cartoon for Belli's exquisite rock crystal plaque in the Biblioteca Apostolica in the Vatican, the Museo Sacro. Comparable rock crystals exist in the Vatican of Christ carrying the cross and the Lamentation, but Polidori's corresponding drawings don't appear to have survived. It appears that Belli, unlike his rival Giovanni Bernardi, certainly designed some of his own plaques, and his most ambitious and sumptuous work is the signed Medici casket, now in the Museo degli Argenti in Florence, made in 1530 to 32 for Pope Clement VII to give to King Francois I in October 1533 on the occasion of the wedding of his niece Caterina de' Medici to the Duke of Orleans, the future King Henry II. It contains 24 separate rock crystal plaques with scenes of Christ's Passion, all set in elegant silver-gilt and enamel framework emblazoned with the Pope's name, the Medici arms, and his impresa. Certainly this would have been a casket worthy of Raphael's design, and it provides some idea, but rather later, of the sort of goldsmith's work that Raphael had been designing. In 1517, Raphael was again involved in work that was essentially of an arti minori character. We learn from correspondence between Lorenzo de' Medici, the new usurping Duke of Urbino, and his secretary Goro Gheri, that they wished to use a portrait drawing of the Duke by Raphael in chalk for the new coinage. 2 weeks later, the request is made again to the Duke by Goro Gheri for the portrait image, and subsequently the portrait appears struck on a golden ducat, albeit a rather feeble little image. Sherman suggested that Raphael may also have provided designs for 2 coins for Pope Leo X, and the reverse of a medal of Baldassare Castiglione, a more ambitious image, has also been attributed to Raphael. The Pope had vaunting ambitions for his nephew, Lorenzo, the new Duke, whom he arranged to marry Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, niece of Francois I. And accordingly, Raphael was commissioned to paint a portrait of Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, for the Duke's bride, which was formerly in the Spanyaman collection and is, of course, in this exhibition today in New York. A St. Michael and the Devil, now in the Louvre, which is also here, an appropriate gift from the Pope to Francois, who was the fount of honor of the great chivalric order of Saint Michel, and the so-called Holy Family of the Louvre, also here, which is a present from the Pope to the French Queen to celebrate the birth of the Dauphin, for whom Leo X stood as godfather. There were clearly many other gifts, and in a letter from Rome of the 3rd of February 1518, Baldassare Torrini wrote to say that the portrait of Lorenzo by Raphael was almost finished, that he was trying to contact the goldsmith Michelino to do some work for the Duke. We learn that 2 pieces of lapis lazuli had been sent to Michelino in Florence, while on the 19th of February 1519, Lorenzo referred to quello che dice Raffaello da Urbino et quanto scrivete delle maniglie. We discovered that these handles, maniglie, were sent the day before to Florence. The Michelino referred to was a sometime friend of Cellini's, the goldsmith Michele da Francesco Naldini, or Nardini, who appears in the papal accounts between 1513 and 1531. Vasari mentions Michelino as a noted rival of their other celebrated papal goldsmith, Pier Maria Sabaldi da Pescia, and so Sherman suggested that Michelino was supplying jewelry for Lorenzo's bride, and that maniglie was a reference to bracelets. But this seems, as we shall see later, a needlessly complicated interpretation of the more precise wording in the correspondence. There's a celebrated engraving by Marcantonio Raimondi for a perfume burner supported by 3 adorsed maidens standing on a swept triangular plinth. A variant of it in reverse was engraved by Marco Denti da Ravenna. Now, the Marco Denti image, which is arguably superior in quality to the Marcantonio original, and may well be the original, as Elizabeth Miller has recently suggested, is signed on the second state SR, or Raffaello Sanzio. The motif is then repeated in the form of a candlestick by an anonymous engraver and also by the I'm sorry, I've cut that out, and also we'll cut that back in. Also by the Parmese Enea Vico in reverse. And the design of the perfume burner, the design of the perfume burner traditionally has always been given to Raphael, but even the lyre-shaped handles consist of confronted salamanders. And the salamander was the device of François Ier, which he coupled with the motto Nutrisco et exicting, or Nutrisco al buono stingo el reo. I nourish the good and destroy the bad. Moreover, the domed lid is pierced with fleur-de-lis-shaped punches that confirm that the perfume burner was destined for the French king. And although it's usually been described as bronze, it seems unlikely it was made of this base metal. It was made of silver gilt, almost certainly made of silver gilt and enameled like Cellini's salt cellar of Francis I in Vienna. And the idea of the Adorced Maidens appeared earlier in one of the tapestries of the Acts of the Apostles as the hours supporting a clock dial. And that design has been usually given to Giovanni da Udine, but was probably derived from an earlier idea of Raphael's. And later the perfume burner evidently enjoyed great popularity at the French court, as in 1546 the motif was reused by Francesco Primaticcio for a fantastic masquerade costume devised for a ball given on the evening of the marriage of Claude II de Guise, Duc d'Aumale, with Louise de Breze, daughter of Diane de Poitiers. And Francesco Primaticcio's original drawing for it is in the National Museum, Stockholm, on the left-hand side. It was seen by Giulio Alvarotti, ambassador of the Duke of Ferrara, who described it in a letter to his master of the 4th of August, 1546. This extraordinary costume accommodated the head of the person, masked in a sphere on which the Graces stood with little jets of perfumed water springing from their bare breasts. The sphere rested on a table with veluted legs, with beneath a skirt of rich draperies, while the feet of the person, masked, were disguised as lion's paws. It doesn't seem to be noted that the original perfume burner or the print must have been the source of Primaticcio's mask design. Indeed, something similar had already been used by Primaticcio for the stucchi in the bedroom of the Duchesse d'Étampes and was later, 1560-61, to provide Germain Pillon the idea for the monument to the heart of Henry II. Raphael's original design demonstrated his profound knowledge of classical antiquities for the composition. By the way, that's the tapestry designed by Giovanni da Udine on the left-hand side. Raphael's original design demonstrated his profound knowledge of classical antiquities, for the composition is derived directly from a Roman hecation, and the Juno-esque form of the maidens quotes a Venus Genetrix type, thought to have been invented in bronze by the Greek Callimachus. Raphael's maidens were then slimmed down to conform with the Fontainebleau tastes. And it's worth noting that Raphael's lost perfume burner clearly exerted a much greater influence on French art than Benvenuto Cellini's celebrated salt cellar in Vienna. Related to this perfume burner is an unpublished and very damaged drawing in the Fine Arts Museum at San Francisco. It appears to have been made for a mace or wand of office. Designed following the format of a vertical rectangular box, is on the left-hand side, fixed to a staff. The box was then to be articulated by narrow frames on all four sides, the side visible provided with an unintelligible inscription reading Dom 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth. This is enclosed by a guilloche moulding, flanked by a garlanded and satyr herms standing on lion's paw feet. In a frieze above the inscription are confronted salamanders with a central small loop handle terminating in fleur-de-lis, which follows a similar pattern to the perfume burner. In the moulding beneath the inscription is a frieze of rinceaux terminating in a central satyr mask in the basement. Snakes appear above a doorstone on the attic and below, attaching the mace head to its staff. Of course, satyrs in antiquity were lusty attendants of Bacchus, while snakes were an attribute of satyrs. For we remember that Faunus, wishing to ravish his daughter, plied her with wine, but only had his way with her by turning himself into a snake. And I suspect with the abundant use of satyrs, the mace was intended to be carried by a master of revels or toastmaster associated with the feasting for the French wedding. The drawing style belongs to a late Raphael, early Giulio type, and is emphatically not by Polidoro, to which it's attributed. Now, I believe two vases of antique taste were being made in Italy at the same time as gifts from Pope Leo X to the French court, about 1518 to 19. They're both now lost, but are recorded in two engravings made by Agostino Veneziano in Rome, and have been hidden amongst an extensive miscellaneous suite of 12 vases published as late as 1531 to 33. Lettered with the misleading title Sic Romae Antiquae Sculptores ex aere et marmore faciebat. It is clear that several of the set of vases were genuinely copied from restored antiques, but certainly the two that concern us here must have been designed by a Renaissance artist. The first was a tall can-shaped vase with high shoulders and lion-masked handles from which are suspended Medicean diamante rings. And around the shoulders a frieze of linked Medicean rings, and in the frieze below, contained by a rich foliage festoon, stalks a lion, which seems rather perilously supported on a laurel branch. The companion vase, egg-shaped, with tall looped leafy handles terminating in satyr masks, has a central frieze ornamented with a low relief with prowling lions with a ranceau of laurel, confronting a Medicean diamante ring. The lower section is ornamented with vertical ribs, while the shoulders show that the body has a delicate craquelure effect of setting fissures in stone. The imagery of both these vases with their Medicean rings, laurel branches and lions can only refer to Duke Lorenzo, or more likely Pope Leo X, and the style points clearly to Raphael or his school. It may seem curious that these magnificent designs took so long to be published. We assume that they were being designed for 1518, 1519, and know that Raphael died in 1520. And judging from the presence of laurels, lions, and diamond rings, the presumed patron who commissioned the vases either have been Leo X, who died in 1521. And we recall that Giulio Romano, Raphael's principal heir, who inherited much of his studio, left Rome for Mantua in 23-24, never to return again. And then in 27, there was a terrible disaster of the sack of Rome, which heralded the mass exodus of artists from Rome. The old nucleus of former Raphael pupils was broken up. Marcantonio fled to Bologna, Peruzzi to Siena, Polidoro to Messina, and Giovanni da Udine to his native Udine. It was only after the renormalization of Rome, circa 1528, that some of the patrons, artists and printmakers trickled back to the metropolis and could make use once more of such images created by Raphael before the sack. The style of these vases is admittedly close to Giulio, but I believe they may well be Raphael, and I believe that this is what the lapis lazuli is used for, and I believe this is what the maniglie are associated with. I'm just finishing. It might appear from this paper that amongst the arti minori, Raphael particularly favoured metalwork. This is certainly by no means the case. We know he was commissioned to do tapestries, and we're being talked about after this. To sum up, it is apparent that Raphael, in spite of his short life, really was concerned with very many aspects of design. He was above all an efficient manager, capable of subcontracting and running a very efficient workshop. But the younger artists were trained by Raphael, like Giulio, Polidoro, Peruzzi, and Perino, carried on in this tradition of designing for the applied arts. But we must remember that the source and stimulus was always Raphael. Cool.